So real quick before I get into the message today, last week when we were together in all three of our services, we took a minute at the end of the message, and I asked you to just take 1 minute with God, to either find peace with Him or maybe for the very first time make peace with Him. And I had so many conversations after that experience was done. But one of the things about being a large church is I'm confident there were people in the room at all three of the services who made peace with God. But I didn't get to have a conversation with you, or maybe you didn't have a conversation with anyone at Suncrest around that. And I want to talk to you just for a minute about a very important next step. If you made your peace with God last week, I want to ask you to be baptized. It is the right next step. And we have some resources for you. So if you go to our website, this is the address, suncrest.org/baptism. You can be baptized online. It's awesome. I'm only kidding. You cannot be baptized online. We do lots of things online, but we don't baptize people online, okay? There is some great info there, including a message that I recently did about baptism. If you think, I want to learn a little bit more about this, but I just don't want you to fall in the trap that I see people fall into a lot, where they think, oh, baptism, that's sometime later after I get my life kind of cleaned up a little bit. It is not that. Baptism is initiation, not graduation, and you should get baptized, not because it'll get you to heaven, because it won't, but because you don't want to start off your walk with God where you just made peace with Him, and then you immediately delay or deny the first thing He asked you to do after making peace with Him. So I really, really hope that you will take that step, talk to someone at the Welcome Center, be baptized. We had someone who was at the Thursday night service last week who was baptized in the 10:30 service on Sunday morning, and I just love seeing that happen that quickly. That's the beauty and the picture of baptism the Bible gives us. So we are in week 4 today of What Makes You Happy. Next week is the last week of this, and so I'm going to do a quick review here at the beginning. There's been 2 key concepts that we've been talking about, so I just need you to participate with me. First question, what makes you happy? The answer is no thing will make you happy. It's always about a who, not a what. It's always relational. This is about making peace with God, making peace with ourselves, and making peace with others. And if you can get to that relational spot, life can be very, very good for you. And then we dove deep on that idea last week at the core of it, the idea of making peace with God. The second idea that's present in this series, say, what makes you happy? The answer is sowing, right? It's the idea that happiness, and the way that the scriptures describe it, is actually not immediately accessible. There's nothing I can give you today that will make you happy tomorrow. It does not work that way. And as much as we wish that it did, happiness and the pursuit of it is always an experience of planting in the spring and then harvesting in the fall with some work and some cultivation and some nurturing and some weeding and some things that go on all through that process. It is possible for you to experience it in the next season of your life, but it comes with sowing. And that's actually the concept that I want to dive deep on today, because I think there's one very particular aspect of this that if we don't think clearly about it, according to the scriptures, it will trip us up constantly on the concept of sowing. So you're probably like me in this sense. One of the most frustrating things that can happen to you is when you see someone else and you see them making choices in their life that you know are going to lead them down a bad path. Like you can almost see it unfolding in front of you. And maybe it's because of your own experience. You made those choices and you know where that goes. Maybe it's because you really care about a person. You don't want them to make those choices. And I mean, it's true, right? Life is hard enough as it is. There's enough pain in life that's unavoidable that it just saddens me. It bothers me when people make choices that will add then to that pain. You know, Jesus is the one who said, in this world, you will have trouble. That's like nobody's life verse, right? People don't cut that one out and put it up on their mirror. We probably should. In this world, you will have trouble, but you can have a limited amount of trouble, or you can have a lot of trouble. And a lot of times, can't you? You can see people going down the road, and then you wonder, should I speak up? Because people get real defensive when you try to call them on things in their lives, and you wonder, do I have enough of a relationship? That's a good question. Do I have enough of a relationship to speak into this? But you can sometimes see that happening in other people's lives. Sometimes you can even see it happening in your own life. Has that ever happened to you? Where you're making certain choices in your life, and you actually feel a little bit out of control in making these choices. You keep making them, and you know if this stays on this course, it's going to play itself out somewhere, and the end of the story is not happiness. It is destruction. It's death. It's not good. And so today what I want to do is I want to talk to us a little bit about the two paths, one of which is happiness and one of which is pleasure. And I want us to think about those pretty precisely, pull them apart a little bit, and talk about the purpose that each one of them serves, but how when we mix them up, it can go totally wrong for us. So before I get into that precise distinction, let me kind of introduce this from the perspective of Jesus. So he was teaching, and this is recorded in the Gospel of John, the biography of Jesus that John did, in chapter 10, verses 10 and 11. And this is what he said. He said, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy." The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. Now, we could have a conversation about who is the thief, but let me just set it on its side this way right now. If you thought about your life, and I thought about my life, and you think, man, who is it in my life right now that has the greatest potential to steal something from me, to kill something, it's a relationship that I have, or to destroy something in me? Who is it in my circle that has the greatest potential to steal or kill or destroy? We all know the answer to that, right? And the answer is in the mirror. The answer is in the mirror. You and I, more than anyone else around us, have the great potential to steal, to kill relationships, and destroy our lives based on choices that we've made. We even think about it this way. We say, I can't live with myself. I'm so disconcerted. There's so much dissonance inside because I've made certain choices. And what we have to acknowledge in the midst of our life is, if that's our story, here's just the truth, right? You financed it. You watched it. You drank it. You smoked it. You dated it. You slept with it. And some of you married it. And there's a common denominator in all of that. And when we look around and think, who should we blame for the idea that my life is not in a good place right now? It would do all of us well to step back one moment and say, maybe I should consider that it's me. Maybe the choices that I'm making are actually what's stealing and killing and destroying. Now, Jesus doesn't want you to live that way. Jesus has an entirely different way for you to live, but he acknowledges that that's true. Then Jesus, as he's teaching, he kind of turns a metaphor here. He says, I have come that they, that's us, may have life. Not steal, kill, destroy, but to have life and have it to the full. Now, the Bible that I read when I was growing up had a different word in there. Instead of saying have it to the full, it described this as have life more abundantly. And I actually think that's a better idea, a more abundant life, something that's remarkable, something that's extraordinary, that you could have a life, and a life that's, the actual meaning of the word is not pertaining to ordinary circumstances. You have a life that's different, better than almost everyone else. That's what Jesus came to give us. And then he says this, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And Jesus says, let's be honest about this. There's two competing ways that you could go. You could go the way where you make your own choices and you kill and steal and destroy. Or you can align your life with me, and I have a better life, a life marked by happiness that's peace with God and peace with ourselves and peace with others. It is an extraordinary life. Of course, one of the things we have to acknowledge when Jesus turns us on this metaphor is that he's calling us sheep. And I don't know if you know this, but sheep are stupid. That's actually the idea behind this. And all the people who are listening to Jesus would have known that. And of course, we can live with that a little bit, can't we? Because remember, it was you who financed it. It was you who ate it. You who drank it. You who smoked it. You who dated it. You who slept with it. You have been making some bad decisions. I worked on that all day. You got to give me a little credit on that. Can we acknowledge that that's true about our lives? So if that's true, or if it resonates with you to any degree at all, maybe the helpful thing to do would be to pull apart these two concepts that are given to us in the Scriptures. There's the concept of pleasure, and there is the concept of happiness. Pleasure and happiness are not the same thing. It's not that one is evil and one is good. That's not the direction that this is going. But they are distinct and they play different roles, and when we prioritize them in different ways in our lives, we'll get to a much better place. So let me just kind of draw the distinction here. With pleasure, that's about the feeling that comes now. With happiness, it's about the feeling that comes later. And pleasure is immediately accessible, right? You can have an experience that feels good. You can drink something and have it feel good. You can do that and it'll feel good right now. Happiness is sowing and reaping. It's one distinction. Another distinction. Pleasure is temporary. Happiness is ongoing. Now this is very important because even though you can experience pleasure now and immediately, it doesn't last very long. In fact, one of the ways that pleasure will start to trip us up is after that feeling's gone, we'll want to tap into it to get it again. But pleasure, by its definition, almost has an experience of diminishing returns. If one drink was enough to make it feel good last night, then pretty soon it's going to take 2 drinks, and then when 2 drinks is enough, it's going to take 4. That's the nature of pleasure. Pleasure and happiness have something in common. They actually are both a God-given capacity in your life. Both pleasure and happiness are God-given. Remember, pleasure is not sinful. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying avoid pleasure. I'm saying put pleasure in its right place compared to happiness. How do I know that pleasure is God-given? Well, think about the things that bring pleasure. God created pleasure in the sexual relationship. He did that. That was his idea. And if you read the Scriptures, you'll find plenty of evidence that he did that quite intentionally. Think about Jesus. You know what Jesus' first miracle was? He turned water into wine. Jesus made wine, okay? It's not evil to have a drink. It's not. I mean, can you kind of picture this? Jesus is out there with his disciples. He's like, all right, let's get this thing started. Disciples are like, you want to heal somebody, Jesus? No, I don't want to heal somebody. Wine. That's what I want. Now, we all know that those moments of pleasure, the things that you can experience that make you feel good, when under control, can be wonderful. And when they get out of control, they start to undermine everything. And so this is the idea, that pleasure has limitations, but happiness is transcendent. You see, the ways that you experience pleasure aren't evil until the pleasure kind of puts its hooks into you and starts controlling your behavior and telling you what to do, and you start listening to it. Happiness, as I've tried to describe, is the thing that transcends the highs and the lows of our lives. If you have peace with God, peace with yourself, and peace with others, it takes the highs of your life and it accentuates them and extends them. And it will take the lows of your life, and sometimes you'll make better choices, so it will eliminate a low. And on the lows you cannot avoid, it will mitigate the pain of the low because you're at peace with God, peace with yourself, and peace with others. You have someone to share it with. Happiness transcends everything. And so this is where I want us to kind of live today, on this distinction between happiness and pleasure. On the screen. Prioritizing happiness empowers the experience of pleasure. Now I'm going to flip that in just a moment. I'm going to talk about what happens when we prioritize pleasure over happiness. But live with me on this one just for a second. If we prioritize happiness, if we prioritize being at peace with God and peace with ourselves and peace with others, then we get the chance to experience pleasures within certain parameters, and they're awesome. If you focus on saying, I'm going to make sure I'm in a healthy place, I'm content with me and God, I'm content with myself, I don't have to reach for something, and I'm content with others, then I can have a drink and enjoy it. And I can stop after 1 or 2. If I'm content with God and content with myself and content with others, you can have a sexual relationship within your marriage and enjoy it. and you don't have to seek it anywhere else. If you're content with God and content with yourself and content with others, you won't have a gambling problem or a spending problem or a debt problem, because you won't start reaching for all those things that satisfy something in you when you push the button, because you're satisfied with who you are. And so pleasure is a God-given, beautiful thing when it follows happiness. When you and I prioritize happiness, and I say it's more important to be content with God, content with myself, and content with others than to have the next feeling, you can be in a very healthy place. But we know a lot of people don't do that. Jesus was teaching some of his followers. It's recorded in another one of the Gospels. I want you to kind of follow Jesus' teaching here, because he's real straightforward about things. Here's how he starts it out. He says, "Are you so dull?" Now, what's the word dull mean? It means dumb. I mean, Jesus, I don't know if you'd be offended if Jesus said this to you, but sometimes Jesus just speaks in very straightforward terms. He's trying to lead people. And he says, I got to call it what it is. Are you so dull? Do you sharpen your minds a little bit? Don't mush together happiness and pleasure. Don't put them together, because the moment they're together and they're squishy, then you kind of everything goes. And what you have to do is you have to pull these things apart, think clearly about them, and see how this works. And then he gives us a very candid example. He says, don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't get into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. Thank you, Jesus, for the image of how the digestive system works. Appreciate that. And he said, this is important. In saying this, Jesus declared that all foods were clean. People used to get confused about this. They used to think, I can't eat that, I can't drink it. Jesus says, it's fine. The evils, the desires that you need to pay attention to, they don't start with what you put into your body and then create something in you. He says, actually, quite the opposite. He went on. What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. He says, listen, if you're focused on the externals, you're going to miss the whole point. What you want to start with is the nature of your heart. Now, people will give generic advice. They'll say, you should follow your heart. Should you? Sometimes. When your heart's in a healthy place, you should totally follow it. But it's actually out of our heart that evil desires come also. What is our heart? It is the center of our being. It is the center of our desires. What's the whole idea that we've been thinking about when we say happiness is about loving God, loving ourselves, and loving others? The idea is love the Lord your God with all your heart. And if you and I would listen and pay attention to the greatest commandment, to make our peace with God and to connect everything inside of us, inside the center of our desires, with God himself, it will bring us peace with God, which of course paves the way to peace with ourselves and then equips us to have peace with others. Put your heart there, you're in a good place. But if your heart is discontent, if your heart is unhappy, if your heart is unsatisfied, if your heart is not at peace, you will start making other choices. And this, of course, is where pleasure goes wrong. You see, most of the time, when people take these pleasures of life, which are fine in moderation within their limitations, but killers once they hook you, the reason people get hooked is because they're unhappy and they're searching for the feeling of happiness. And they want a shortcut. I'm telling some of you the story of your life right now. You want a shortcut. I need it to feel this way now. I need to feel this way tomorrow. And so you reach for the pill, the bottle, the girl. That's the very nature of what God is describing, what Christ is describing to us here. He says, you need to really pay attention to this heart of yours and where it's connected and what it desires and whether it's satisfied or not, because if your pleasures start to drive you, they will lead you to a prison. And instead of the pleasure being something that's under your control, where you could say yes or no to it anytime you want, where you don't need it for a quick fix, where you don't need it to get through the day, where you don't need it when your eyes land on it, you can be happy. But if instead you find yourself reaching for that pleasure instead of happiness, and you reach for it again and again and again, the pleasure becomes a prison. And it has you hooked. And this is where God-given pleasures transform into something ungodly, into sin. Remember on week 1 we said that sin always escalates, that sin always separates us from that peace with God and with ourselves and with others. That's the very nature of this. I shared with you on the first week this verse from James. Let me back it up a little bit and then zoom in on that verse. Here's how James writes about this. He says, each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. When the pleasure comes calling for you, and it's enticing, it's seducing, it says one more, a little more, one more time. It says you deserve it. You've worked hard, you're tired. She treated you wrong. And it just draws you in. When that evil desire that is inside of you is enticed, then, after the desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is full grown, it gives birth to death. Do you remember this from week 1? Those little desires that are inside of our heart that seem so innocent at first. I called them, those sweet little baby sins. Those sweet little baby sins that you can easily justify. If someone tried to call you out on one of them, you'd get defensive like that. But this is the big question. Are you able to stop whenever you want? Are you at peace with God and peace with yourself and peace with others enough so that it doesn't lead to a place where you're reaching for a pleasure that eventually puts you in prison? See, here's the idea behind prioritizing pleasure. When we prioritize pleasure, it actually steals the experience of happiness. Pleasure and happiness are not the same thing. Happiness is more important than pleasure. They're both God-given. If you have happiness first, then you get to enjoy pleasure. That's how it works. But the moment you flip that and you put pleasure in place of happiness, you get neither pleasure nor happiness. And how you and I think about constructing our lives, we should just be honest with ourselves. Have you ever wanted to live an abundant life, an extraordinary life, a life that doesn't have to pertain to normal, a life that isn't like everyone else's, a life where you understand who God is and who you are and you're in relationships with others? And have you ever wanted a life like that? There are all kinds of examples of lives like that that are recorded actually in the Scriptures. I don't know if you've ever read Hebrews chapter 11. If you haven't, you should tonight. Hebrews 11 is a beautiful chapter. We call it the Hall of Fame of the faithful. And all the Hebrews writer does for the whole chapter 11 is he kind of goes back and he describes men and women of the Old Testament who trusted God. They had their peace with God, and it gave them a peace inside themselves, and it equipped them to have peace with others, and they lived extraordinary lives. And what it meant, since they had this peace internally, is that all the external of their circumstances of their life mattered less. And it goes through and tells the stories of one after another, after another, after another. And when it gets to the end of chapter 11, it talks about the kind of life you can have if you're at peace with yourself. Now, you may or may not want to sign up for this life that I'm going to describe to you here in just a moment. I'm going to read it straight from Hebrews 11. You may or may not want this. I hope that you do, because I hope that you think, I want to be the kind of person who could endure tough things and be okay with it when I'm in sync with God. But think about the lives that these people lived. This is how they're described. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. It was not a glamorous life, but it was an extraordinary life. A life that was marked by abundance, a life that was not pertaining to the ordinary. And it was people who had nurtured this peace with God and peace in themselves and then peace with others who were able to take those lows in life and say, I can endure those. And I don't have to reach for something in the middle of them. These, of course, are extraordinary people. And then when the chapter flips from chapter 11 to chapter 12 in Hebrews, it suggests to those of us who are also believers, who are making our peace with God, that the people who went before us, the people who actually paved the way for us, they're in the heavens and they're looking down on us. The scriptures describe them as a great cloud of witnesses. And here's how it describes them. It says, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Now, chances are you will never be put in the position where you might be sawed into. Thank God for that. Chances are you don't have to live in a cave or a hole or endure floggings or imprisonment, any of those things. We don't live in the extreme circumstances that they lived in. But the principle to say, I'm the kind of person who would have the peace with God and peace with self and peace with others is true. And it says, here's what you need to do. You need to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles you. So I want to ask each of you a question right now. I want to ask you a question. I want you to, if you'll trust me, to answer it honestly. I am not going to ask you to raise your hand after this is done. There's no trick to this. This is honestly just a question for you to reconcile in your own mind. This is not a question I'm asking you about the person sitting next to you. It's very important. This is a question I am asking you about you. And I want you to be honest with yourself. Here's the question. Is there any pleasure that you're engaging in that is undermining, hindering, or entangling your happiness? Is there any pleasure right now that you're engaging in and you've put it above happiness because it's now undermining or hindering or entangling your happiness? Is there any pleasure, hear me, is there any pleasure that you are engaging in that is undermining hindering or entangling your parenting? Is there any pleasure that you're engaging in that is undermining, hindering, or entangling your marriage? Is there any pleasure that you're engaging in that is undermining, hindering, or entangling your friendships? Because if there is, I want to invite you to stop being the thief who will kill and steal and destroy something. And instead, to trust that Jesus is the Good Shepherd and He has a life for you. It's full and abundant. Let me pray for us right now. God, for some of us in the room, there's a conviction stirring in our heart. There's a defensiveness that wants to argue back. God, my prayer is for a confession that just tells the truth about ourselves. And God, I thank you that you are a good shepherd who will lead us out, who will lay down his life, who will forgive us of wrongs, who will cleanse us from all unrighteousness, but will not pretend that happiness can come through pleasure. And so, God, I simply pray that for anyone in this room who senses a conviction, that they would not leave here unchanged. Help us, God, in the name of Jesus. Amen.